Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, it's no good standing up here if you can't be heard. First of all, I'd like to commend those that have been here today. It's been really good. I did get a bit dozy, but I think that was from effects of last night. But anyway, it's been great. Their numbers might be small, but it's like panning for gold, and when you see those little bits of specks in there, you're onto something, and you people are surely that's something. Now, I'll just have a whoops, one. Your bloke, you have been to the zoo? He's great. Now, this is, the title was The Making of a Social Creditor, but it could also be subtitled What Went Wrong in the Murray-Goulburn Valley. The Making of a Social Creditor was the title chosen because of the vital role a social creditor could play in Australia today. This talk covers the period 1950 to the present day, and is also the story of my working life. So what I would like to give you is a picture of the prosperous days of the soldier settlement in northern Victoria, and then what it is like now in a very changed rural landscape. I will then explore what went wrong and why. Oops, wrong one. Now, the soldier settlement was a program to resettle diggers after World War II. My father was a returned man and one of the successful applicants for a block. Lessons learned after the World War I resettlement programs were incorporated to make the new venture successful. One of the special provisions was the establishment of long-term loans at low rates of interest. The term of the loan was 55 years and the interest rate 2.5% plus 1% sinking fund. It was expected the settlers, or blockies as they became known, would always be able to survive an economic downturn, whether it was financially or climatically induced. Books were written about the settlement, like A Blockie's Wife and Hard to Go Bung, extolling the virtues of the project. Dad and I arrived in America about the 3rd of November 1950, and I began work as a surveyor's chainman with the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, who were the overseeing body of the settlement, the irrigation development. My father joined other blockies on the gangs developing the land for irrigation. There. Dad and I lived in a corrugated iron garage until Christmas Eve, and then I moved into the State Rivers camp while he went back to Gippsland to see about the disposal of our farm, because the government demanded that all of the blockies' resources be put into their farm. You weren't allowed to have build up assets anywhere else. Living in the camp was much better than the hot, dusty garage without running water and a toilet. I left the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission the following spring to work at home for a few years, and in 1956 sought work as a herd tester in the Balcomore area. The job was one of the big moments of my life and tended to colour my worldly outlook to this day. In those days, the tester lived on the farm, staying overnight, and after routine work moved on to the next farm. My first farmer was a Jehovah's Witness. The second rated himself as a Balka Mormon, and the third a Seventh-day Adventist. That was the first week. Then there were various Catholics, Methodist, Anglican, Presbyterian, and others not really church-going, but generally had a Christian outlook. There were some who had alcohol problems and war-related illnesses. I was accepted into all their homes as one of the family, and I tell you, I could spend quite some time, very enjoyable time, telling you about those 3.5 years. When I look back on that time, I can see in it the beginning of my social credit development. It was a wonderful time, and all of those people were part of my extended family as I was of theirs. I even found that they burnt the toast and scraped it in the sink as we did at home. Most of the blockies were interested in new technology, so tractors and other new farm machinery were being introduced into the district. It was not only because it was new technology, but also the farmers were becoming prosperous and willing to spend on new ideas. One of the new inventions, or new innovations, was artificial insemination, as it was called then. Now the terms used are artificial breeding and artificial breeding technician for the fellow that does the work. Meetings were held around the district to introduce the new breeding methods to the blockies and encourage them to form cooperatives and employ trained staff. The meetings, you imagine, soldier sellers, the meetings were always accompanied by lewd amusement, whereas today not an eyebrow would be raised. I left herd testing and trained as an inseminator to work for the newly formed Murray Valley Artificial Breeding Association. I received a lot of teasing and good-natured banter. Wags at the Numurkah Apex Club, of which I was a member at the time, presented me with a new membership badge which I was supposed to wear at all our meetings. Oh. I would often be regaled or treated to versions of the Cow's Lament, which went something like this, and I hope I don't offend anybody by this recitation. I've just given birth to a calf, sir, and with motherly pride I am full. But pray do not laugh, and please do not chaff when I tell you I've not seen a bull. The farmyard's a drearier place, sir. The meadows are no longer gay, since the one bit of fun in the year's dismal run has by science been taken away. No bull has embraced me with passion. I've not had the ghost of a binge. I haven't been loved, but ruthlessly shoved by a girl with a great big syringe. You may say that is all very well, sir. There's some things a cow should not say. But those veterinary tarts who play with our parts still do it the old-fashioned way. The first time the inseminator went to the farm, there was always considerable interest. One farmer rang to say that he had cows that morning, and would I call into the house before going to the dairy? And you wouldn't believe it. Mum, Dad and about 7 kids all come down to the dairy to see the fun. It's a bit different in the cities, isn't it? Anyway, here I am, giving the cow an injection with the whole family very interested looking on. The following year was also interesting, as many farmers were expecting 2-headed monstrosities and disappointed to find normal calves and no more than normal birthing problems. In 1961 I married Alison, and this changed the demands on our lifestyle. Workplace agreements were unknown then, and rural folk generally anti-union. In 2 years with the AB Co-op, I had 14 days off the first year and 21 days the second year. I had to work Saturday and Sunday, expected. The 3 weeks in the second year was to get married. And so my honeymoon was my holiday. I sought changes to my work arrangements, and that led to a disagreement with the AB management, and they promptly terminated my services. Excuse me. I called into a local engineering shop on the way home, and the owner asked me how I was, to which I replied, I'm not too sure, as I have to go home and tell my wife I don't have a job. And he said, I'll give you a job. And I asked him why he'd take me on. I never had any engineering skills, couldn't weld, much else. And he said there were many young fellows like me off farms who were recruited into the services, and they quickly became mechanics, aircraft fitters, etc. And they did a first-class job with only basic training to start them off. I'll give you a go. 12 months later, my father asked me to come home and give him a hand on the farm. My time at the engineering shop ended, but it was one of the most enjoyable periods, and I learnt a lot to help me during the rest of my life. That's how I became a dairy farmer. The Blockies were buying new cars, tractors and other machinery. Hay sheds were chock full of hay, and there was time to enjoy other social pursuits. It was the door-to-door travelling salesman's paradise, with a sale at almost every farm. I tell you, they sold encyclopedias, washing machines, mix masters, everything. Because the Blockies were doing so well, it also spread to the local towns and small business boomed. Services like schools and other community activities expanded. Marriage breakdowns and suicides were practically unknown. During this period, and from humble beginnings, saw the nascence of Murray Goulburn Dairy Cooperative, now one of the largest cooperative enterprises in Australia. Life was good. It was great. Life on the farm was hard work but fairly rewarding. Indeed, things were looking so good, I learned to fly a light plane and even dreamt of owning my own Victor Air Tourer. But things began to change. It was gradual at first, and even today, few can explain the cause of the change. Well, now we'll move along a few years. In December 2006, on a sweltering day, a memorial was unveiled at Katunga. It was one of 3 across the soldier settlement area with the names of the original Blockies. The week before, I had a brainwave and drove around Balcomore to photograph the original dairies. Balcomore. The original dairies no longer being used as working dairies. Balcomore. There were approximately 128 dairies in the Balcomore area, and I took 64 photos that day. The important point to note is, where there was a working dairy, there was once a happy family. It does not mean the land is no longer being used or unoccupied today. Many of the original farm lots have been subdivided, the water sold off, and they have become lifestyle properties. The occupiers now work in secondary or tertiary pursuits, and today actually produce little for real consumption. Last February, I heard an interview on Rural ABC with a dairy farmer over Campaspe Way. He had bought a farm down in the Western District and was moving his whole operation south because of the changed circumstances in the Goulburn and Murray Valley. How things have changed. Back in the 1960s and 70s, if anybody wanted to go dairying, Northern Victoria, the Murray-Goulburn Valley was the place of choice. What went wrong? We've had dry years before, but why is the drought having such a devastating effect? As I said earlier, it was gradual and insidious, almost hidden from close scrutiny, and only those who have studied aspects of history closely connected to uncensored economics would be able to understand the malaise. I started herd testing in February 1956, and in the spring of 1957 the average herd size by my 24 farmers was 47 cows. You could say the farmers took the production off the 47 cows, put it into the national pool, and they got back a standard of living. A standard of living far better than enjoyed today by farmers milking 5 or 6 times as many cows. They had more time for their families and leisure pursuits, building their communities and much else. They were not abusing the environment with added chemicals and the pressure to factory farm. In general, life was good. The change started with a slow increase in cow numbers, cost increase, so it was easy to milk another cow. Some farmers had a few pigs. They had mixed farms then. But the bacon market dipped, so farmers were advised to specialise. In other words, milk more cows to make up for the loss of income from the pigs. And they did it well. Milk was transported to the factory in milk cans, and as milk production increased, so did quality problems. And there was a drive to chill the milk on the farm and transport it to the factory in bulk. This was welcomed by the farmers because it did away with the early milkings and the tedious, back-breaking task of handling cans. Many of the farmers had to resort to an overdraft to pay for the new bulk VAT. But that was okay, because it was easy to milk a couple more cows. As the cow numbers increased, so too did the time milking cows. So the next innovation was herringbone dairies, which had the added advantage of eliminating the stooping to attach the milk cups to the cows, because the cows were elevated to the height of the milker in the herringbone dairy. Herringbone dairies cost money, so the overdraft was extended, and it was easy to milk a few more cows. The milk was being removed from the cows very quickly in the herringbone dairy and dumped into milk vats that were not designed for it, and the result was butterballing and other quality problems caused by agitation of hot milk. In other words, the milk was not being cooled quickly enough, so a new standard of vats was introduced. They were bigger, with greater cooling capacity, and needed more electrical power. That in turn involved the electricity supply company and a few more dollars. All together now, milk a few more cows. More cows, more milk, quicker milkings led to cleaning and hygiene problems. So stronger detergents were introduced or they were brought into use, and this in turn caused other problems. The metal parts of the milking machines were invariably tin-plated brass, and the new detergents eroded the tin plating and began breaking down the metal, causing contamination of the milk. All brass parts had to be replaced by expensive stainless steel, and they added more cost to the farmer. There were many other off-farm innovations making financial demands on the farmer, such as the requirement for a farm plan, the National Livestock Identification Scheme, quality assurance programs, brucellosis control, and more. I could go on, listing the efforts made by dairy farmers to maintain their standard of living by milking more cows, but with little increase in disposable income. As farmers' cow numbers increased, so did the requirement for more pasture for grazing and hay. This in turn needed more water and fertiliser. The farmer was finding he needed bigger and better tractors and equipment, rotary dairies, milk silos, and large-scale land forming for irrigation were becoming standard practice and cost money. In the mid-1960s, the farms started changing hands. The newcomers never had the financial advantage of the blockies, long-term low-interest loans, and alternative finance was only available on shorter terms at higher interest. The financial treadmill was starting to take its toll. The farmer no longer produced enough feed for all the livestock carried, so out paddocks were purchased for haymaking and grazing. In general, the farms were overstocked, and this was brought to a head in 1976 when the first of the livestock culls were carried out. Hungry animals were destroyed and buried in pits, and I tell you, it was heartbreaking. We have had restructure of the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, the phase out of milk contracts, dairy deregulation and water trading deregulation, none of which has been much benefit to the continuing farmer. Sometimes it was called tariff reform, but it was always associated with higher costs. The psychological pressure required to cope with all this happening is enormous. Marriage breakdown and suicide become endemic, leading to the employment of rural counsellors. The formation of groups like Beyond Blue is an indication of a sick society rather than a caring society. And I can tell you, it's much harder being a good cowman, husband and father with the added stress. And how does the government help? It doesn't. It adds to the misery by increasing its taxes, fees and charges each year by the inflation rate. In other words, it feeds on inflation. Small business has to raise prices or go broke, whilst the farmer tries to milk a few more cows to make ends meet. Now I'd like to finish by showing you some pictures that I trust will be truly worth 1,000 words. The first is a graph showing the trend in water use in the Murray-Darling Basin since 1920, taken from the Living Murray discussion paper. The horizontal line at the top is the mean average flow of water down the Murray. And the upward sloping line is shows the total accumulated water use each year in the basin. And we have been at the limit of our water use for several years. If you take into consideration the fluctuations of the mean average up here associated with dry years. Dry years, it's down here. Look where we are. That's a couple of years old. I showed it to a farmer recently and he pointed to it here and he said, why didn't they start doing something about it here? That's a good question. Nobody asked, what can we do to reduce rising costs, to reduce the need for more water? I surmise that the water graph, or the water use graph, must closely resemble the cumulative inflation rate. The next graph is the collective rural debt taken from ABS figures. Rural debt has escalated $10 billion in the last 2 years of this graph. Please note the trend in these figures. The trend makes forecasting possible. And I contend it is not sustainable for a viable primary industry in Australia. The next is a table of figures provided by Wayne Swan, the Commonwealth Treasurer, and shows the total tax collections each year for the last 20 years. You will see that the Howard Costello duo led the highest taxing government we have ever had, and this does not include the GST. A graph from the table illustrates it more clearly. The trend is ever upward. It's my belief the Rudd Labor government will upstage the Howard Costello Liberals and could be included in the Guinness Book of Records as Australia's highest ever taxing government. There is no apparent limit on their taxation over us. Oops, I'll just go back one. Here, that is without GST and that is with GST, just to give it to you. Showing it as a graph is much more presentable than a table of figures. The final picture is a graphic illustration of the effects of inflation, and I find it helps people to understand how financial policy impacts on their daily life. You can see how inflationary pressure puts pressure on unions, wage demand strikes, which in turn impinges on industry. Likewise, inflationary pressure on government leads to bureaucracy, regulation, taxation, and an increase in the national debt, in turn impinging on industry. And it doesn't matter what industry does, by way of innovation, development, then they go in for advertising, they get into debt, you have takeovers, rationalisation, amalgamation, increased debt, overcapitalisation, bankruptcy, unemployment, and anarchy is the final result. Industry tries all manner of means to survive, but in the end it is left with job cuts and despair for employees and employers alike. This is not the complete picture, but an introduction designed to bring understanding to people with a desire to make Australia a better place for their family and their families. The title of this address, The Making of a Social Creditor, was chosen because it spans a lifetime. I believe understanding our social credit involves study, experience and reflection. My first days as a herd tester living with different families gave me an early insight to people when I was fired with the exuberance of youth. I tell you, boy, it was exuberant. And it was only understood in later years while reflecting on the past with a certain maturity. The engineer who gave me a job when I thought I had little to offer. 45 years later, I thanked him on his deathbed. It was an emotional moment for both of us. My years as a dairy farmer also opened my eyes to the wonders of our Creator. To see a newborn calf searching for its mother's teat, how does it instinctively know what it must do for its survival? And the wonder of a multitude of ibis gliding in from the heavens to forage the irrigated pastures, or an eagle soaring thermals, is something to behold. Every day brought something new. I'm grateful to the time spent with people of this movement: Eric Butler, Jeremy Lee, Tom Fielder, Betty Lukes, and many others too numerous to mention here today. Only social credit has the answers to the foregoing troubles of the farming sector and extending into the wider community. The just price principle is the first realistic step to eliminate inflation. The situation where a similar scheme worked was in the past on one item was the superphosphate bounty. It was a working example of a consumer subsidy. Speaking in the debate on this legislation, this is from Numurkah Leader, 13th of October 1971, super bounty to stay until 74. Speaking in the debate on this legislation, Mr Bruce Lloyd, member for Murray, pointed out this type of assistance was most valuable because it reduced production costs and encouraged good farm management practice. Well, I don't know about the last bit, but it certainly reduced production costs and it saved milking a few more cows and more water. But the application of social credit principles depends on us, each of us, each of you and me. And there you have it. Social credit is a gift from God, and debt finance is an instrument of satanic forces, and at the moment we are seeing it in its ascendancy all around the world. But I believe we can make a difference. Thank you for listening.